Borders and embassies closing, foreign workers being recalled, and travel warnings issued. Regional neighbours respond to the growing tension in Libya. But will there be a wider fallout from the unrest? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougaida. Locked in an uneasy balance of power and on course for confrontation, loose alliances of former fighters in Libya are lining up against each other. Forces loyal to former General Khalifa al-Haftar have taken up arms against more religious groups dominating Libya's fractured government, while vowing to rescue Libya from terrorists. Now, it's raising concerns that the instability will spill across to Libya's neighbours. Saudi Arabia has closed both its embassy and consulate in Tripoli for security reasons. Libya's neighbour Algeria has closed its embassy because of what it said was a real and imminent threat. It sent special forces into Tripoli to evacuate its ambassador. Algeria has imposed what it called a maximum state of emergency along its border with Libya. And Egypt, meanwhile, has banned its citizens from traveling to Libya, and it's also stopped Libyans from crossing into the country. Tunisia's Ennahda movement has voiced its concern over the latest violence. It denounced the offensive by the maverick general Khalifa al-Haftar as a coup attempt and pressed for stopping the bloodshed in Libya, providing favorable conditions for stability and calm, and starting an inclusive national dialogue together with all political rivals and to pave the way for reconciliation. Meanwhile, the United States says that it's watching the situation in Libya very closely. It's made a limited response. 4 more U.S. aircraft have been moved from Spain to Sicily, along with 60 Marines, and they're on standby if needed to evacuate U.S. embassy staff. Well, 200 Marines are already at the base in Italy as part of a unit set up after the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. That was in 2012. It's also understood the U.S. is sending a high-level diplomat to Libya to help the political process. All right, well, let's get the views of our panel on this unfolding story in Libya. We have from Beirut, Joseph Keshishian, who's a senior fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Saudi Arabia. With us from Washington, D.C. is Mark Kimmitt. Mark is a former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs and a retired Brigadier General for the U.S. Army. Welcome to you to this edition of Inside Story. Good to have you with us. Joseph Keshishian, I'll come over to you first and ask you, do Libya's neighbors have real reason to be concerned here?
I think that Libya's neighbors do have a reason to be concerned, because what we are seeing occurring in Libya is a repetition of things that have been going on elsewhere throughout the Arab world in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, where you have confrontations between liberal voices that really wanted to change the dynamics of Arab societies and the Islamists that have made a dramatic push. In Libya, of course, we are seeing an unfolding of the conditions, but Libya is not the only country affected by it. Egypt is affected by it, Tunisia is affected by it, and Syria is affected by it. So we see a spillover effects, if you would like. One of the consequences of the Arab Spring, although our attention is on Libya, we shouldn't really be surprised that the confrontation between Islamists and liberals is now reaching such a boiling point.
Right, but I'd just like to understand from you, Joseph, whether you think what is happening in Libya right now, and especially with the developments of Khalifa al-Haftar, going to Tripoli. I mean, is that going to have a direct effect on countries like Egypt, on countries like Algeria?
It certainly might, because obviously the instability in Tripoli itself and in Benghazi and in Zaytan and so many other cities will lead to confrontation between different branches of society. Now let's remember that there are significant differences between a country like Libya, where the Islamists are not supported by the majority of the population in a country like Egypt, where in fact the Muslim Brotherhood is quite popular. But nevertheless, I think that if there are confrontations in the streets of Libyan cities, certainly this will be affecting neighboring countries that will then have to make a decision as to whether or not they would want to control the spillover effects of this kind of violence, especially in Egypt, where elections are scheduled and the Muslim Brotherhood is boycotting. And obviously the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt will take solace from an uprising in Libya if one were to occur. So therefore, whatever happens in Libya will have a direct impact on the neighboring countries.
Mark Kimmett, so what do you think?
Well, I agree with him that we need to, in the long run, be concerned about the spillover effects. Egypt, in particular, is concerned that the instability inside of Libya will cross over the borders and affect not only the political situation inside of Egypt during the election campaign, but could also have a effect on stability within the country as massive numbers of armed rebels or fighters flows into Egypt.
All right, let's bring in our third guest from Derby, Mohammed El Jarih. Mohammed is a Libyan activist and writer for Foreign Policy magazine. If you can hear me, I'd just like to ask you what you think the impact of what's going on in Libya today with Khalifa al-Haftar, will it have an impact on the wider region?
It will absolutely have an impact on the wider region, and this is why I think there will be a lot of interest from regional powers like neighboring Egypt, Algeria, and others. And the way that it will affect those regional powers is because Khalifa Haftar is championing the cause or like positioning himself as the fighter of extremism in Libya, and that has been the appeal or the campaign slogan for him in Libya. And for that reason, I think Haftar is positioning himself in a way so that he can actually secure the support of the Egyptian army, from Algeria, and as well from the United States and the EU.
How much support, Mark, does Haftar have from outside powers?
Well, I think at this point the U.S. is watching the situation on the ground. I don't believe that some of the reports that suggested he was a CIA stooge for many, many years. Clearly, the United States and most of the world nations want to see stability come back quickly to Tripoli. But Haftar is more of a symptom rather than the actual core problem that we're seeing inside of Libya. What we're seeing inside of Libya right now is the failure to form a government that is inclusive to all the people inside the country and can retain and maintain a monopoly on the use of force. The significant amount of militias, as exemplified by Haftar's actions, that are permitted inside of Libya is contributory to the instability, and until a central government retains the use of military force by its means only and starts to provide some measure of protection and stability inside the country, I think we're going to see more of this rather than less of this.
A few important points you raised there, Mark, but Joseph, on one of the points that, in fact, Haftar is not the CIA's man in Libya. I mean, some reports dispute that. What do you think? He did spend more than 20 years over in the United States and recently went back to Libya.
Well, I mean, he has a very colorful background, and sometimes we forget where these people have been, what their origins are, how many years they've spent abroad, and why all of a sudden they show up now. Haftar obviously was a product of the 1970 revolution along with Muammar al-Gaddafi, and Gaddafi rewarded him back in the 1970s by turning him into the commander of the army. But of course, the two men parted ways because Haftar really botched up the Libyan invasion of the Chad in 1980. Let's remember that that conflict lasted from 1980 to 1987, and it turned out to be an utter disaster for Libya. And of course, Haftar was in command of it. He messed it up, and Gaddafi asked him to leave. He lived in the United States for a long period of time, and all of a sudden, he comes to Libya after the revolution in 2011, as the number two man to Mr. Yunus, who was assassinated shortly thereafter. Then he disappears again, and all of a sudden, a few months ago, he shows up, albeit he is taking advantage of the vacuum that has been created in Libyan society, because there are fundamental differences in Libya today between the Islamists and the liberal voices. Why all of a sudden we have Haftar showing up? Nobody knows. How come he is leading this movement, what he calls the Liberal National Army, if you would like? Nobody knows. There are lots of questions about this man. We don't know who is behind him. And I agree that outside powers like the United States, European countries, Saudi Arabia, and other countries want to have some kind of stability return. But let us not dismiss the point that outside countries are also manipulating the internal scene in Libya, and that's the dangerous aspect of the situation.
How so? Can you elaborate on that point, Joseph?
Well, I mean, the point is that obviously, as I said at the very beginning of my remarks, we have, as a spillover effect of the Arab Spring now, fundamental differences between Islamists and more liberal voices throughout the Arab world. Some in the West actually are siding with the liberals, while others are siding with the Islamists, hoping that there will be a kind of winnowing out, if you would like, and we'll just wait and see who will be the ultimate victors. This kind of presence, this kind of opportunity is created, therefore, for outsiders to manipulate the two sides, whether it is in Libya, it is in Egypt, or elsewhere. It really does not matter that we're talking about Libya. The phenomenon is applicable to everywhere. But clearly, without any question, in my mind at least, that Libya is a perfect example where we had the international coalition intervene with force in 2011 to overthrow Gaddafi, and then leave the arena open for the locals to duke it out amongst themselves. That's an arena for opportunity for outsiders to manipulate at will, and many of them have.
We're going to talk about the response, or perhaps some say the lack of response of the international community right now when it comes to Libya a little later in the program. But Mohammed, focusing on Haftar and coming over to you, authorities are saying that he wants to carry out a coup. He says he has no mandate. What is his mandate?
His mandate, just to clarify that one of your guests said, where has Haftar been, or why is he coming out now? Actually, he has been there all the time, and he has been campaigning for this for so many months in Libya, openly, in the streets of Benghazi, the streets of Al-Marj, and other places in Libya. His mandate came through constructive engagement with a society that has become disillusioned, or with increasing disillusionment with the democratic institutions in Libya. Basically, he spoke to the tribes, he spoke to the army, the remaining army units in Libya, and he is coming out now when Libya got to a tipping point. This has been in the making for the last 2 years. It's not a surprise that we see Khalifa Haftar coming out now. And basically the mandate that he has is that he is championing the cause and the concerns, the fears of the tribes, local communities, and of the armed forces that have been subjected to an assassination campaign that has been going on for the last 2 years. As well as that, Tripoli has been reluctant to deal with the rise of extremism, especially in eastern Libya. There has been so many demonstrations in Benghazi and throughout eastern Libya and in Libya as a whole. But Tripoli failed to respond to the concerns of those people, failed to engage with them constructively. Haftar did that, and this is why Haftar is gaining a lot of support in the last few days. Entire cities have come out in support. Their tribal leaders, their civil society, their military leaders, all have come out in support of Haftar. This shows that he has actually planned this in a way very well and engaged constructively with key players on the ground, key players that Tripoli has failed to engage in the last 3 years. And
Marco,
instead,
what do you think
Tripoli
the mandate, right?
Sorts of engaged.
Mark, your opinion on what the ultimate aim is here?
Well, I think that the point that has been brought up is whether it is better in a post-conflict situation after the air campaign, would it have been better to put an international force, a stability force, implementation force as we did in Bosnia, into the country to maintain stability while the country goes through the political process and move forward? Or should it have been left to itself that once a bombing campaign was over, that the international forces left and the country healed and reconciled among itself? I think what we're seeing here is a situation where if you depend on the country to do it itself, it's going to be done in some cases through reconciliation, in some cases through violence. And clearly the case that we're seeing here with General Haftar is that he attempted to do this in a manner that was more consistent with the international norms, but running up against brick walls and significant opposition, felt it necessary to return to arms to bring forward the post-Gaddafi environment inside of Libya.
And of course, Mark, we must mention the strength of the militia groups in Libya and the tribal society.
No, that's exactly right. And that's militias in some cases can be very helpful because they can provide for the security of individual groups or tribes or neighborhoods. But quite frankly, the record of militias permitted militias throughout the Middle East, in some cases have been, and in many cases, in fact, most cases, in the long run has been a scourge in the Middle East. Monopoly of force has to be imposed by the central government, and only the centrally elected central government or appointed central government should be able to use weapons against the citizens of that nation. And here we're seeing a situation where the militia is using weapons against not other people of the nations, but other tribes and other political opposition parties. That in fact, weapons are being used in place of political dialogue.
Mark, a little earlier on, you also said that Libya is in the state of, if I can use the word chaos, as it is today, because of the failure to form a proper government. But do you think that the power and the strength of the militias was underestimated?
Well, I think more importantly, the power and the capability of a post-conflict society to have a political process that emerges to the satisfaction of everybody in the country was underestimated. This is where the international community can come to the fore. That's bringing in the capability of the United Nations to effect reconciliation, to provide for a political path forward, to provide for the ability of the country, which has undergone a significant degree of violence. The United Nations, in particular, can be the honest broker to bring everybody together. I believe the absence of the United Nations in a significant manner inside of Libya is one of the contributory factors which has led to another outbreak of violence.
So are you saying that the West should be taking responsibility for what is going on in Libya right now?
What I'm saying is that the world has a responsibility through the world body, which is that of the United Nations, to help the people of Libya to emerge from the post-Gaddafi environment and develop and establish a government that is fitting to the people of Libya. It's being proven to be far more difficult.
But that has not happened yet.
Internally or
right, but 3 years after the revolution, it hasn't happened yet. So let me ask you, those countries that helped to overthrow Gaddafi and facilitate his overthrow, have they abandoned Libya?
I think that they have not certainly abandoned Libya, but they certainly have not been in Libya to the extent and to the degree necessary to prevent this latest outbreak of violence. So
Joseph,
if that's your definition of abandonment, then I agree with you.
Right. It's not my definition. I'm just trying to understand what your point is. Let me cross over to Joseph Keshishian. Joseph, have NATO countries, those involved in the overthrow of Gaddafi, abandoned Libya?
Oh, absolutely. Not only they've abandoned Libya, they've abandoned most of the Arab world. I think that this is a very clear situation. We are only concerned when there is obviously our immediate interests are at stake, but more importantly, I think that we are afraid of these extremists, and therefore we worry about 200 young ladies being taken hostage by Boko Haram. We're worried about insurgents taking over, militias taking over in Libya, and we're worried about what's going to happen in Egypt. But 150 to 200,000 people get killed in Syria, and that's routine, essentially, and as if those lives have no value whatsoever. And imagine what's going to happen when the Islamists take over Syria in the next few years. Then we will have to shed real crocodile tears to find out whether or not we live up to our expectations. I think that the hypocrisy is too obvious for people to overlook. What needs to be done is to come to terms with the fact that the Arab world is going through dramatic changes in the post-2011 period. Some of this is going to be very unsettling. We're going to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and perhaps there will be casualties, but we should not be surprised that the Arab societies are fighting it out amongst themselves in order to create the kind of environment where freedom and liberty will return, instead of having dictators like Gaddafi in Libya or Bashar al-Assad or others in Syria and elsewhere. That's the big struggle right now.
You raised a few points a little earlier on about the international community, but let me ask you what it should be doing right now, what it can do right now to save Libya and also stop the possible spread of the chaos to neighboring countries.
I think that the most important thing that needs to be done is for Western countries and moderate Arab countries to speak with a clearer voice than we have been. We cannot really speak one thing in one country and apply it in another. I think that consistency is the name of the game here. We have to really come out once and for all forcefully against extremists, whatever it is, whichever society it occurs. There cannot be a debate about this. I think Western countries have to remain true to their own values and support those liberal elements throughout the Arab world that really want to introduce the permanent changes. And in Libya, we should not really be concerned, if you would like, with the fact that militias are in the streets with lots of weapons, because the winnowing out will essentially take care of itself. We should not really condemn one side or the other. What we should condemn is the fact that there are individuals who are preventing the normal course of the constitutional process that everybody wishes would be in a peaceful environment. The fact that Libya, since the beginning of March, has not been able to accept a single prime minister. They're on the third one right now, and they cannot even bring themselves to discuss the new constitution, is an indication of where our interests ought to be. Western countries and conservative Arab monarchies and others should really forcefully stand with the law and should stand with genuine reforms that will bring freedom to these countries.
Mohammed, Joseph was talking about weapons awash in the country just a moment ago, and let me put this to you, because according to the United Nations, it's saying that Libya is now a primary source of illicit weapons, and it's been trafficked to at least 14 countries, fueling conflicts on several continents. Quite dangerous.
It is quite dangerous, and this is why I will argue that the international community did not forget about Libya. Actually, the United States, the UK and the EU have all appointed special envoys to Libya in the last few weeks or days. And the international community, and especially the EU, cannot afford to ignore the situation or the developments in Libya. The international community concentrated over the last, or focused over the last 2 years on technical help and assistance to Libya. But at the moment, Libya requires political solutions, requires political help. And this is where the efforts of the international community should focus, that they should help the Libyan factions or the Libyan political groups to come together in order to come up with a new comprehensive political deal that will address many of the issues that we're facing in the country, including the issue of weapons that are scattered throughout. This is very important for the international community to do, but I think the international community realizes that, because the UK recently appointed Jonathan Powell, for example, as a special envoy to Libya. The UK yesterday announced that David Satterfield is to become a special envoy to Libya as well. These people are going to be essential and crucial. They will play a crucial role in bringing those political factions and political groups together to one table.
Final thoughts to Mark Kimmett, because I see you nodding along. I mean, can control be exerted over these militias, Mark?
Look, the fact remains the easiest part of the Libya operation has been regime change. Bringing the military in for a bombing campaign was easy. But the consequences and the security vacuum that was created after the bombing campaign by not putting American troops or Western troops on the ground or Arab troops on the ground to provide that stability, so in that stability the constitutional process could go forward, is that abandonment that you had talked about earlier, And in that vacuum, that's where the militias came in. And now they are trying to assert themselves not only with violence, but also in a political manner.
Okay, thank you very much for that final thought. I'd like to thank all my guests, Mohammed Al-Jarh from Derby, Joseph Keshishian joining us from Beirut, and Mark Kimmett in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us. And you can always add your voice to this discussion and others as well. You can find us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can send us your comments to @AJ Inside Story. That's on Twitter. I'm Daddy Abu Gheda. Thanks very much for watching. From me and the whole team, goodbye for now.